From the heart of Vietnam, the journey began. With faith as his lantern, a soul's noble plan. Through Laos and Thailand, the borders dissolve.
Vì sao sau tuổi trung niên, có người có khuôn mặt hiền lành phúc hậu, có người lại có khuôn mặt hung dữ tràn đầy oán khí? Đó là vì tướng do tâm sanh, tướng tùy tâm mà thay đổi. Khi tâm đẹp thì tướng mạo sẽ đẹp theo. Ái có thể dưỡng hành. Người trong lòng tràn đầy tình yêu.
Welcome to another deep dive. Today we're going to be looking into the conflict in Myanmar.
Okay.
And, we've got a pretty fascinating set of sources here. News articles, historical analyses, and even a piece about media and a Vietnamese monk who's advocating for peace.
Wow, that sounds like quite a bit.
Yeah, it is a lot to cover. And but that's what we do here. We try to figure out what's the most important takeaway for all of this.
Absolutely. I think taking all these different sources together will help us understand this conflict a little bit better.
So one of the things that really jumped out at me just from reading this stuff is just how long this has been going on. This is actually considered the world's longest running civil war.
Wow.
Dating back to 1948 when they got independence from Britain.
Wow. That's over 70 years.
It's unbelievable, isn't it?
Yeah, and to understand it, I think it's really helpful to go back and look at the history of this conflict. Starting with the clashes with communist insurgents.
Right.
And then in 1962, the military takes over in a coup d'etat. They establish a junta that rules for decades.
And this is where the name Pat Madaw comes from, right?
Absolutely.
Which is what they're often referred to as.
Exactly.
So then fast forward a little bit, you have the 888 uprising,
Right.
which was a nationwide pro-democracy movement. Aung San Suu Kyi comes into prominence at this point. The military cracks down on protests
Yeah, brutally.
and just really shows you how deep these divisions run. And they've tried to do so many peace agreements over the years, but it seems like they all kind of fall apart.
They really do.
It makes you wonder if lasting peace is even possible in Myanmar.
It's a good question to be asking, and I think it helps if we look at all the different actors that are involved. We have the military, of course, and then you have all these different ethnic armed organizations.
Right.
The EAOs.
EAOs, right.
Exactly, and they represent all sorts of different ethnic minorities who have been fighting for autonomy and their own rights for decades.
So it's not just like the military versus the people.
No, not at all. It's a very multifaceted conflict.
Yeah.
It has very deep roots, and there's a lot of alliances and rivalries at play here.
And then in 2021, I think you could really call this like a turning point in a way.
Yeah.
The coup.
The coup, exactly.
Yeah.
The military seizes power in 2021 and reignites the conflict with just a ferocity we hadn't seen in a long time. I mean, you saw protests, brutal crackdown, millions of people displaced, but it also led to the emergence of new armed resistance groups like the People's Defense Forces, the PDFs,
Right.
who are made up of ordinary citizens who are taking up arms against the military.
Yeah.
So again, you're adding another layer to this conflict.
It's crazy. I mean, the 2021 coup, it's like it really transformed the conflict into what some are calling a hybrid war.
Right.
What does that even mean?
That's a great question because it sounds kind of scary, right?
Yeah, it does.
So you have traditional military forces clashing with all these various armed groups, including the EAOs we were talking about before, and now these civilian-led PDFs.
Right.
And then on top of that, you have this huge information war that's being waged online.
Yeah.
With propaganda and misinformation spreading like wildfire, especially on platforms like Facebook.
That's scary.
It's a messy, unpredictable situation where, honestly, the line between who's a civilian and who's a combatant is totally blurred.
So just to recap, we have this incredibly long-running conflict with deep historical roots, multiple armed groups, all with different agendas. And then after this coup, we have this added layer of hybrid war on top of it all. It's just crazy.
It's a mess.
So one thing I found interesting, too, is the role that the international community is playing.
Absolutely.
You have countries like the U.S. who are kind of indirectly supporting the EAOs through the Burma Act, providing funding and resources.
Right.
What about China? I always feel like China's got to be involved somehow.
China's a really fascinating case here.
Right.
They're presenting themselves as like a mediator in the conflict,
Right.
but there's also a lot of allegations that they're providing support to the military behind the scenes.
Interesting.
Yeah, they're walking a fine line, trying to maintain stability in the region, but also protecting their own interests in the process.
It sounds like nobody wants to openly pick a side in this, which I guess makes it even harder to find any kind of solution.
Yeah, I mean, without a clear international consensus on how to deal with the situation in Myanmar,
Right.
it's really hard to put any real pressure on the military junta.
It's just heartbreaking to think about the impact all of this is having on the people who actually live there.
Yeah.
You know, one article mentioned a really devastating airstrike on a Kachin Independence Organization celebration.
Right.
80 people dead, 100 injured.
It was awful.
And to make matters worse, the military actually blocked medical aid from reaching the victims.
I know, it's just inhumane.
It is. How do you justify that?
I know, and that incident, sadly, is just one example of the horrors that are unfolding in Myanmar right now.
Yeah.
The impact on civilians is just devastating. You know, beyond just the casualties and the displacement, you have to look at, like, the economy's crippled. Human rights abuses are rampant. There's this climate of fear that's just everywhere you go.
And it was really hard to read about the women and children, especially like how vulnerable they are in all this. One source talked about how there's been this sharp increase in sexual assault and exploitation since the coup. It's like they're the ones really paying the price.
Absolutely. And to make matters worse, there's the role of media and propaganda, too.
Yeah.
You know, the military junta, they've really tightened their control over all the official channels.
Oh, yeah.
They control the narrative, and they're just spreading so much misinformation.
So how are people even supposed to get accurate information?
It's really tough. A lot of
Yeah.
people are relying on independent media outlets and citizen journalists,
Oh, wow.
but it's risky. You know, they're risking their lives to report the truth.
Yeah.
And even then, access to information is hard, especially in those more rural areas.
That makes me think about one of the more interesting figures that we read about, that Vietnamese monk Thich Minh too.
Oh, yeah.
He's been advocating for peace in Myanmar. I mean, it's pretty incredible. He's actually going into conflict zones, spreading messages of compassion and understanding.
It's remarkable to go into those areas. I mean, that takes serious courage.
Yeah, I was really struck by that.
He's using his platform to amplify the voices of the everyday people who are suffering the most.
But it's got to be risky for him, right? Operating in a place with such tight media control?
Of course. I mean, his message of peace could easily be distorted or manipulated by the junta.
Oh, right.
You know, we've already seen how they use propaganda to paint anyone who disagrees with them as terrorists or enemies of the state.
That's a scary thought.
It's a terrifying reality over there.
Yeah.
And it makes you think, like, what more can the international community even do to support people like Thich and all the organizations working for peace inside Myanmar?
It feels like we've just been hearing about sanctions and condemnations for years now. Is that even enough?
It's a big question. And honestly, there's no easy answers. Some say we need to intervene more directly. Others say that could just make things worse.
And then you have the 2025 elections coming up.
Right.
Do you think those could be a turning point?
It's hard to tell. The military's already said that they plan to keep a major role in the government, no matter who wins.
Oh,
Plus, there's a lot of doubt about whether those elections will even be free and fair.
yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
remember they staged the coup in 2021 after Aung San Suu Kyi's party won by a landslide?
So it's possible we could just see the same thing happen again. More violence and instability.
It's a very real possibility, and it's a big concern. You have to look at all these factors. The military's hold on power, the EAOs, and what they're demanding, the whole pro-democracy movement. It's really tough to predict what's going to happen next.
It sounds like the country is really at a crossroads. Right now, the future is completely uncertain.
Yeah, it's easy to get lost in all of it, just how complicated this all is.
Yeah.
But I think it's so important for us to not forget about the people, the people whose lives are just being completely upended by this.
Oh, absolutely. And I think these sources really highlighted how resilient the people of Myanmar are. I mean, they've been through so much for so long.
Yeah.
But they keep fighting for a better future. Think about people like Thich too.
Yeah.
Risking his life to advocate for peace.
Yeah, it's amazing. Or the journalists and the activists who just work so hard to expose the truth, even though they could be arrested or worse.
Yeah.
I mean, their courage is unbelievable. It's really inspiring.
It really is. And it's a good reminder that even in the darkest of times, there's still hope. and there's people out there doing amazing things.
Mm-hmm.
So what stood out to you from all of this? Like, what do you think is the most important thing for our listeners to remember?
For me, it was realizing that this conflict isn't just some far-off thing that's happening somewhere else.
Right.
It's connected to what's going on in the rest of the world.
Yeah.
And it has consequences that reach far beyond Myanmar's borders.
What do you mean?
Well, think about the refugee crisis. Over 1 million people have fled Myanmar since the coup.
Wow.
They're seeking refuge in neighboring countries like Bangladesh and Thailand.
Wow.
And that puts a huge strain on resources and infrastructure in those countries.
Oh, for sure.
And raises concerns about regional instability, too.
So even though the fighting is happening in Myanmar, the consequences are felt way beyond.
Absolutely. And I think that really highlights why it's so important for all of us to stay informed about what's going on over there.
Yeah.
I mean, it may seem far away, but it's a part of this larger web of global challenges.
Yeah.
Things like human rights abuses, misinformation, a fight for democracy.
So is there anything we can do about it? Like, as individuals, can we actually make a difference?
I know it can feel overwhelming, right?
Yeah.
But I really believe that even small actions can make a difference. You can support organizations that are providing humanitarian aid.
Right.
You can stay informed about what's happening, and you can raise awareness in your own communities. You can even advocate for policies that promote human rights and democracy in Myanmar.
So even just being informed and speaking out can help.
Exactly. And I think it's important to remember that there aren't any easy solutions in Myanmar.
Yeah.
This conflict has been going on for a really long time, and there's a lot of pain and history there.
Yeah.
But I think we need to challenge those overly simple narratives that we sometimes hear and really engage with the complexity of the situation.
So we need to look beyond just the headlines.
Absolutely. We have to listen to the people who are most affected by the conflict and really try to understand how they got to this point.
Well, this has definitely opened my eyes to just how complicated the situation in Myanmar is.
Yeah.
It's a story of resilience and courage, but also a story about the fight for peace and justice that's still ongoing.
Absolutely. And it's a story that's still being written. I mean, the future of Myanmar is really uncertain right now.
Yeah.
But one thing is for sure, lasting peace is only going to happen if everyone commits to dialogue and understanding. And if they're willing to work together to address the underlying causes of this conflict.
Well, thank you so much for taking us through this topic. It's complex and honestly kind of heartbreaking at times.
Yeah.
I really encourage everyone listening to keep learning about what's happening in Myanmar and to think about how these seemingly faraway conflicts can actually have a big impact on all of us.
Biết buông xả và buông xả được thì lòng mới an vui. Khổ nạn của con người thường bắt nguồn từ tham, sân, si. Vì vậy, để sống hạnh phúc, bạn nên buông bỏ bớt ham muốn của bản thân và chấp nhận sự bất toàn là một phần tất yếu của con người. Một đời người khi đến trần trụi, khi ra đi cũng trần trụi. Ăn uống một ngày cũng chỉ là 3 bữa cơm, ngủ cũng chỉ cần đến 1 phòng. Vậy thì ôm dục vọng quá lớn để làm gì? Trong khi nó chỉ khiến con người ta luôn luôn cảm thấy không thỏa mãn. Dục vọng quá lớn cũng là nguồn cơn của mọi khổ đau trên đời. Con người muốn bớt phiền não, đầu tiên cần phải học được cách buông. Nhưng hãy hiểu rằng buông chính là buông tham muốn, chứ không phải là buông bổn phận và trách nhiệm. Có những lúc con người sống không
thầy ơi thầy mỏi chân không, thầy đi khất thực bắc nam mấy vòng đầu trầm trầm đất bao năm, ngủ trên sương gió không nằm mấy lầu. Miền Bắc tháng 7 mưa ngâu, miền Trung nắng cháy ra đầu. Thầy tôi đông về lạnh tím đôi môi, giao thừa nghĩa địa thầy ngồi an nhiên. Thầy tôi tâm sáng như gương, cho người soi tỏ cho mình sửa tâm. Mặc đời lắm những ma vương, tâm thầy vẫn sáng từ bi tột cùng. Thầy ơi con hỏi một lời, vì sao thầy sống cuộc đời gian nan, mặc cho nhân thế luận bàn, một lòng theo Phật mặc người gièm pha. Thầy tôi đức hạnh vô song trong veo, tính lòng tựa hồ mùa thu. Thương sao một kiếp chân tu kiên cường, tính tân dạng người đức tin. Thầy tôi tâm sáng như gương, cho người soi tỏ cho mình sửa tâm. Mặc đời lắm những ma vương, tâm thầy vẫn sáng từ bi tột cùng. Thầy tôi tâm sáng như gương, cho người soi tỏ cho mình sửa tâm. Mặc đời lắm những ma vương, tâm thầy vẫn sáng từ bi tột cùng. Được hạnh thầy dẫn lối chúng sinh như trăng soi sáng vô minh kiếp người. Thầy tôi nguyện cả một đời làm theo Đức Phật, sống đời yêu thương. Mỗi bước chân, mỗi nụ cười kiên định tu tập không cầu lời danh. Tâm thanh tịnh, sống an nhiên từ bi bác ái gieo duyên cho đời. Thầy tôi tâm sáng như gương, cho người soi tỏ cho mình sửa tâm. Mặc đời lắm những ma vương, tâm thầy vẫn sáng từ bi tột cùng. Thầy ơi con hỏi một lời, vì sao thầy sống cuộc đời gian nan? Mặc cho nhân thế luận bàn, một lòng theo Phật mặc người giảng pha. Thầy tôi đức hạnh vô song, trong veo tính lòng tựa hồ mùa thu. Thương sao một kiếp chân tu kiên cường, tính tuân dạng người đức tin. Thầy tôi tâm sáng như gương, cho người soi tỏ cho mình sửa tâm. Mặc đời lắm những ma vương, tâm thầy vẫn sáng từ bi tột cùng. Thầy tôi đức hạnh vô song, trong veo tính lòng tựa hồ mùa thu. Thương sao một kiếp chân tu kiên cường, tính tâm dạng người đức tin.
Trong lòng tràn đầy tình yêu thương, thì nhọc cử nhọc động cũng tràn ngập tình yêu thương. Người trong lòng luôn so đo tính toán, thì cho dù ở thời điểm nào cũng thường bị có về đi cùng. Một người hiểu được khoan dung thì lòng dạ cũng nhất định rộng lớn. Những người này luôn không so đo tính toán chi ly, cũng sẽ không vì
Đức hạnh thầy dẫn lối chúng sinh như trăng soi sáng vô minh kiếp người. Thầy tôi nguyện cả một đời làm theo Đức Phật, sống đời yêu thương. Mỗi bước chân, mỗi nụ cười kiên định tu tập không cầu lời danh. Tâm thanh tịnh, sống an nhiên từ bi bác ái gieo duyên cho đời.